You are listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place. Hello and welcome to Arcane Carolinas. I am your co-host, Charlie Mushaw.
I am your other co-host, multi-award winning novelist, award-winning podcaster, we should know, Michael G. Williams.
Michael and I have not talked to each other on a call or in person in the better part of probably a month and a half.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 months. To the folks that we've messaged and said, oh, it's been difficult for us to connect. That's not a bit. Yes. Genuine.
Yeah. There's a lot of life happening.
For a multitude of reasons on both of our accounts. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back. We haven't been able to get together to do one of these in a while. We know that people have been waiting for an episode. We hope you like this. It's the end of the calendar year right now, 2023. Looking forward to sharing a bunch of stuff in 2024. I don't think we've done an episode since the WRAL stuff closed. So thank you to everyone that voted for us.
Yeah, we have not. And thank you very much. Yes.
We have absolutely no insight into how that is going. We've heard zero from them. They haven't even updated the page to say when the announcement will be. But the outpouring of support and nice messages we got during that season was awesome. So thank you.
Yeah, regardless of the outcome, just hearing people say that they voted and that they really appreciate us and just like getting that sense of community from it. That's the best thing about it. Connecting with people around this. That's been really good.
Yeah, I think that I was actually having a conversation with someone last week about the nature of Arcane Carolinas. This was somebody at work. And they were like, I found the logo. I was looking for you. I'm like, yeah, we're not really like we have pictures of us on there so people know who we are. But really, it is more about sharing stories and shared history and connecting with folks. So when we have an opportunity to connect with folks, it is what makes us want to keep going. Because like Michael and I are going to hang out regardless.
Yeah.
of if Arcane Carolinas is a thing. So for us, this is fun. But what makes it great is the connections that we've made along the way and that we continue to make and the stories that get shared. The times that I mispronounce things or jumble my words and then we get an email that says, hey, why'd you say it that way? All that matters.
Yeah, totally.
All the sherries.
Speaking of sherries, is now a good time for me to share an extremely important and cool update about a story we did in the fall.
Can we call them sherries?
Yeah, totally.
Or can we just have made that a term?
Yes, absolutely. That is now in the lexicon. That is now part of the jargon. In the spooky season, we did an episode. It was one of the live episodes. It's the one that we recorded and released from Con Carolinas about UFO sightings, a big UFO flap in Robeson County or Robeson County. I'm not sure which way to pronounce it. Somebody made an allusion to us mispronouncing it when I called it Robeson County. So if it's Robeson County, then somebody needs to let me know. In that, I mentioned that there was a publication from the Center for UFO Studies called the Lumberton Report, and that I had located a paper copy. It was extremely hard to find, that there were no scans of it or ebook versions or anything online. The Center for UFO Studies still exists and still holds copyright on all those materials. So I was going to go to a library at UNC Chapel Hill where that book was being stored and be able to read it. Then I contacted the Center for UFO Studies and said, can I scan that book and share it with our listeners? I promise I'm not doing this to try to get rich off of it. I'm not trying to make money doing this. I just think it's a really neat resource. And the Center for UFO Studies wrote me back in less than a day and said, we're actually starting a project to digitize all of our paper materials. And that's pretty high on our list. And if you want to scan it and share it, that is totally okay, as long as you also send the scan to us so that we can mark it off the list. And I happily did so. And in the show notes for this episode, there will be a link to that file on the Arcane Carolinas website so that you can go read that PDF, and you will occasionally be able to see my weird little fingertips holding the page so that I can scan it. But I am so excited that they were totally okay with this. They were so happy to hear that people were still talking about this. I even got to chat with them a little bit about some of the investigators who were included in that talking about how important those people were to the Center for UFO Studies at the time and in subsequent years. So it turned out to be a really great opportunity to chat with some people who really love this stuff. And they were very enthusiastic about people being able to read that book more widely.
It's amazing. I'm excited to read it. I haven't read it yet, so I'll be clicking the link in the show notes. That's not a bit either. It's genuine.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't read it yet.
There's a ton of stuff in there. It is really detailed. Some of it kind of contradicts what I had read about the incidents in the newspaper in a way that clarifies some things. And some of it really unbelievably, amazingly confirms some things. So it's a really fun read.
That is the nature of what we do, though, right? Like we'll find one source that is, and they saw a big green sea monster, and then the next article will say, no, it was brown. And the agreement is they saw something.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
So like certain details might contradict each other, but people saw something.
Yeah.
This is a Michael episode today.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into what our actual topic for this is. And that is a topic that we've kicked around talking about for a while. And that is Appalachian folk magic.
Yes.
Some of this is stuff that I learned in my Appalachian Studies program or stuff that I read about in that program. But I realized while I was putting these notes together that almost everything that I'm going to talk about is something that either I knew someone who did when I was growing up myself in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Western North Carolina, or I knew somebody in my family or somebody in my community who had someone do this for them or do this to them or on their behalf or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some things that I just want to clarify at the beginning. Almost none of the people who engage in these practices would describe them as quote unquote witchcraft, but some of them would. So it's important to not make any assumptions there one way or the other.
Sometimes you feel like a nut. Sometimes you don't.
Exactly. And none of what I'm about to describe comes from what are called closed practices, religious traditions that have an initiatory requirement to access what their rituals are. None of this is that. This is folk magic. This is stuff that was commonly discussed, commonly practiced.
Real onions in your socks kind of things.
Yeah. Anybody who has ever picked a 4-leaf clover and made a wish is practicing folk magic.
Right.
Some of it is a little more complicated than that, but it's that same sense of it's not a thing that somebody has to have a particular identity or a particular cultural association to do. And none of these are particularly tied to dogma, even though some of them were practiced in very specific religious contexts. And sometimes the language around them includes really specific religious context, but it's not necessarily tied to a dogmatic view.
Sure.
Everything I'm about to describe is something I heard of, saw, or had done when I was growing up in Appalachia. So I have actively engaged in some research and found some expanded and alternative descriptions for some of these, but I am not the authority. There is no authority over any of this. So if anything I describe is something that somebody has not heard of, that doesn't mean that their experience is illegitimate. Or if it's something that they heard or saw or did differently, then that just means they did differently in your part of the mountains than in mine.
Disclaimers aside, get with it, man.
I'm not done with disclaimers, though. I just need people to know that there's going to be stuff I missed. There's going to be stuff you've done or heard of that I don't mention or that I mentioned differently, and that's okay.
Sure.
And to that point, if you've got stories or different descriptions and you want to share them with us, I would love to hear those at arcanecarolinas@gmail.com, please. I was reading an article on the really amazingly good website, northcarolinaghosts.com, about Appalachian folk magic practices. And it included the line, in a society where economic and social insecurity are real and constant dangers. And I was like, wow, that's a really great, really efficient way to contextualize a lot of this stuff, because a lot of the stuff is practices that people had that saved lives. Mm-hmm. They needed practices like this to live a lot of times. There were times when there were not a lot of doctors around and definitely not a lot of medicine, not in the chemical pharmaceutical sense.
Right. Not like the Pfizer plant in Sanford sense.
Right. And a lot of what this is might be attributed to placebo effect, but if the placebo effect saves somebody, they still got saved. So I'm happy. Also, some of this is drawn from the experience of what's referred to as Afro-Lacha, the African-American, African diaspora experience in Appalachia. So I don't want to try to claim any ownership over that. Appalachia is a place where a lot of different cultures meet and merge. And so some of this is Cherokee, some of this is Appalachian, some of this is European settlers, some of this is Catawba, some of this nobody knows anymore. A lot of this stuff is a blend of three really specific influences, and that is Cherokee, Western and Central European, and West African. So the first thing I want to mention is something that somebody mentioned on Facebook, actually. And I had heard of it when I was a kid, but I never saw anybody do this. But supposedly I had a relative who could do this. And that is talking the burn out, like being a fire talker or a burn talker.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when a faith healer would talk with a burn victim. And they would recite or chant a charm or a spell. There's also a particular Bible verse, Ezekiel, I think it's 6:16 or it's 16:6. I don't remember which now, that they would repeat over the burn and would cause the burn to heal or cause the burn to heal faster or at least stop hurting. Other than the Ezekiel chapter, there are a bunch of versions of a very similar charm that people would say. And that is, there came an angel from the east, bringing fire and frost. In frost, out fire. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And in some versions, I read that the person would say that while holding their hand near the burn and maybe even moving their hand in a circular motion in the air over the burn. Mm-hmm. And they would repeat that phrase 3 times. Some, they'd just say it until they felt like they'd said it enough. Some, they'd say it once. In all of the descriptions that I read of it, you don't touch the burn, because people had figured that out.
Right.
But this phrase in particular had the ability to call on higher powers to do something. And there's a variation that I saw in some places where instead of bringing fire and frost, in frost, out fire, it's bringing fire and salt. In salt, out fire. Now, some people who use this believe that the success of the healer relied solely on the strength of the specifically Christian faith of the person doing the healing.
Not receiving it, but the one administering it?
Yes.
Okay.
And then some people believed that it relied solely on the strength of the faith of the person receiving it.
Okay.
Some people believed that it relied on them equally, so they'd both better be really strong believers. And some believed that it relied solely on the quality of training that the faith healer had received from their teacher. A lot of these practices and a lot of Appalachian folk magic practices in general, especially if they're more complicated things that require a specialist, like being a fire talker or a burn talker, the belief was that could only be taught intergender from one generation to the next. It had to be intergenerational and intergender.
I've heard of this. I don't know if you told me about this or somebody else told me about this. But
somebody else probably told you about it.
Okay, I've heard of this, yeah.
Yeah, like a woman could teach a man who was younger than she, and a man could teach a woman who was younger than he. But it supposedly would not work if a woman tried to teach a woman or a man tried to teach a man. So I don't know, if you are listening to this and you believe that and you identify as a man, then you're going to need to get a woman to repeat this to you, I guess.
I wonder what the training guidelines are. Right.
Nobody put that part in any of the things that I read about.
I'm picturing like a Rocky style montage.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. No, I'm getting a big action hero montage vibe.
Yeah. Maybe more like Luke in the swamp.
Oh, okay.
You have to carry the other person on your back. Go like running and jumping over logs and stuff.
Yeah, I'd buy that.
While reciting it.
Yes, absolutely. And then you have to set some fires and stick your hand in it a little bit.
Yep.
Also, importantly, most people believe that the patient could not thank the healer and they could not pay them.
Okay.
Because the healing had not been the work of the healer. It was, quote, the work of the Lord.
That's like straight out of the New Testament.
Oh, yeah. And thus, thanking the healer instead of God was supposedly an insult to God. Paying the healer or thanking them gave them credit for doing that work. So you had to not thank them and not pay them. And the healer had to take the attitude that they were not the person doing this. They were simply the channel for it.
Yeah. And healing with credit to the higher power, God, in this case, that's straight out of the New Testament.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going to try to quote it right now because I don't have it in front of me and I'm going to mess it up. But that idea, not that it would be undone or something like that. So like with this kind of thing, I'm not saying that it doesn't work. I mean, you hear about different belief structures will call it different things. A lot of belief structures will consider the power of prayer, right? And that's not just one faith. Many faiths will under the power of prayer. Yeah. agnostics or people that don't believe even necessarily in any kind of higher power. We'll talk about depending on their level of belief in the metaphysical. We'll talk about affirmation and manifesting and that kind of thing and the ability to project. I think when you move into and away from that type of thing into more of the sciencey or pseudoscience, don't throw anything at me for calling it a pseudoscience. But when you look into parapsychology and maybe there is a latent ability somewhere that the human mind can make happen. And then, of course, there's just the placebo effect, which is we don't know why it works, but it works.
Yeah. And you know what? If somebody's burn gets better, I don't care.
Yeah. So I like that one. I like that one a lot because I had heard of that. And I think that on the surface, you might have somebody go, I don't know about all that. But when you really break it down across placebo effect, power of prayer, manifestation, whatever you call it, there are instances where people have had circumstances get better after illness or physical damage.
Yeah. Sometimes also fire doctors, which was another term for burn talkers or fire talkers, they would apply a salve or an ointment to try to help. Mm-hmm. And I found that really interesting. There's butter, which of course we know now is actually not good for that, but that was a common practice.
It's delicious.
It is delicious.
Use unsalted. If you're rubbing butter in a wound, make sure you use unsalted.
Yes. Another one was potato slices. And my grandmother actually used that on me when I had a burn as a child.
Okay. Got that Yukon Gold Redskin?
Just like regular old, whatever the
russet.
Yeah, russet potatoes that were growing in the garden.
Quick aside, what is your preferred potato? Do you like a red-skinned potato, a russet potato, a Yukon Gold?
It depends on the purpose. If I'm making hash browns, I want a red skin potato. If I'm baking potatoes or doing mashed potatoes, I want russets.
Okay.
Or if I'm getting fancy and making Hasselback potatoes, I want russets.
I'm about to do an oven fry with some potatoes, and I'm going to use Yukon Gold. So it's at the front of my mind.
There you go. I know my grandmother would say, go get a potato, and she would slice part of it off and say, hold this on the burn. A paste of baking soda and a little water. That was a common treatment. Vinegar was a common treatment. Baking soda and vinegar mixed together so that it would foam.
I feel like that was smart.
It probably did. And also there's balm of Gilead, which is what it was called, but it was most likely the resin from the balsam tree. That's what it was where I grew up anyway.
Okay.
You'd find a balsam tree, you'd collect the resin from that, and that resin could be used as an ointment. It could be used as a salve. It could be used in all kinds of things. It was a very powerful healing factor. And so that's fire talking as far as I know.
Cool. I like it.
Also, herbal birth control.
Really?
Yes.
For men or women?
For women.
Okay. I was going to say, we're not advocating that you run out in the woods and start chewing on stuff. And I asked for men or women because I can see a lot of guys being like, really? All I got to do is eat.
Nah. Consult a doctor. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
A very common reason to consult a granny or a root doctor or a witch doctor, or which was a kind of folk magic practitioner other than what you think of when you hear the phrase witch doctor. They had a lot of different names depending on places and genders and the local cultural practice, but a really common reason to consult them was to prevent pregnancy. And a lot of different people had herbal concoctions, herbal formulas that they come up with that would make that not happen. And in fact, a great whatever aunt of mine supposedly was the woman in her community who could do that for people. She had the birth control potion formula. She was the local herbalist in her holler, and people would come to her for that.
Hail as old as time. Where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah. When I was in junior high, my mother specifically made a circumstance happen where my paternal grandmother and her living sisters all got together for dinner at our house. And it was one of the few times that they were all together and when they were elderly. And it was explicitly so they could tell stories. And my Aunt Mary particularly was good at this. I really enjoyed talking to Aunt Mary. But Aunt Mary told me about some aunt of ours being the lady who could come up with birth control drinks for people.
Pictures.
They were applied internally. They were consumed. You drank them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a wild story. It was a lot more complicated than that. And in some ways, much more graphic than I think our show needs.
Yeah.
Suffice to say, Aunt Mary told some fun tales.
Please consult your doctor if you need any of that. Do not go Google it and try to run around in the woods gathering supplies.
None of this is medical advice. None of this should be practiced by anybody.
Right.
If any of this sounds good, talk to a doctor.
I do buy into herbalism. I do think that there are concoctions and stuff that can be made. I have a big book, Guide to Wild Herbs, and there are many uses.
Yeah. Oh, I have a whole book about crafting tinctures, and in fact, have given you a tincture.
You have. That's why I used the word tincture when I said that, because it's in that cabinet right there.
But talk to a doctor. If any of this sounds good, talk to a doctor. That's what I'm saying. I don't need to get sued. Another one is tobacco for bee stings and bug bites.
Huh.
This one is really simple, but it is very emblematic of classic folk medicine, folk remedies kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You'd wet some tobacco, wad it up, and apply it to a bee sting. What I was told at the time was this will draw out the venom, quote unquote. And I'll tell you, it definitely made the bee stings feel better.
Probably numbed it up.
Yeah, there's an obvious painkiller effect. My father, when I was growing up, chewed tobacco. And so we would just go get some of his Red Man and get that wet and stick it on there. Before that, he smoked. And there were times as a child that I saw him just break a cigarette open and shake the tobacco out and wet it, even just like spit in his hand and wet it and stick it on a bug bite or a bee sting. That would make you feel a lot better.
That's way cooler than like cracking open your vape and pouring the juice on.
Yeah, I don't want anybody to do that to anything that ever is on me, including
I'm just
me.
trying to think of what the modern suburban equivalent would be like. So, bro, you take your vape.
Yeah. No, thank you.
It's got to be strawberry kiwi flavored. Whatever.
Also, there's this plant called plantain that is not the plantains that you buy in the grocery store. It's regarded as a weed here. It has these big, broad, flat leaves, and it has a ton of uses. It's extremely common, and you can chew up plantain and apply that instead. And plantain actually has been shown to have antibacterial and antiseptic properties. So it could be used to try to prevent infection.
Can I share a story about the fruit plantain?
Yeah, go for it.
And why it's important to know what plants you're dealing with. This is going to make me sound so simple. So I was at the grocery store and I wanted to make fried plantains, and someone thought it would be funny to stick a giant banana in with the plantains. And I bought a giant banana and I took it home. I was cutting it up. My wife goes, I thought you're making plantains. And I'm like, I am. Charlie, that's a banana. I'm like, it is not. It was in the plantain section. So it's just funny. And every time I eat plantains or think of plantains, I get to hear about the time I fried bananas, which weren't bad.
I mean, fried bananas are pretty good.
Yeah, it's fine. It just wasn't what I was going for.
Sure.
So if you can make a mistake in a highly controlled environment like a supermarket, think of all the mistakes you can make in the wild. What I'm driving at here is that it's interesting, these folk remedies and herbalism and all that. People really had to know their stuff.
Well, these people lived a lot closer to nature than we do.
Yeah, that's true.
But they had to know their stuff because they had to keep their kids out of the poisonous stuff and teach the kids not to get into the poisonous stuff.
Poke salad. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Eat it raw, it's poison, and you got to cook it down, and then you can make dinner with it.
There's a lot of that kind of knowledge that was essential to survival in a very literal way.
Right.
So this is a practice, the next one that I'm going to talk about, that is much more directly magical, and that is plugging a tree. And the idea was you could use this to do a lot of different things. It's also sometimes called corking a tree. To cure a child of disease, particularly respiratory diseases, then you would stand the child up against a tree. You would bore a hole at the height of the crown of their head. You would insert a cutting of the child's hair, like a clipping, like a little, lock of hair. And then you'd plug the hole up with a cork or another piece of wood or something like that. Bark from elsewhere on the tree. Maybe you'd whittle a plug from a twig or a stick taken from the same tree or another tree of the same kind. Or if you knew another kind of tree that was also associated with healing in some way, then maybe you'd go get a stick from that so that you'd be combining two forms of healing or two associations there. And you'd make a plug and plug up the hole with the piece of hair in it. And when the child had grown past that plug, then they would be healed. But if the child passed away, then the tree would also die. That was one very common practice. Not common. Everybody was doing it in the 70s when I was a kid, but that was something that was widely accepted as a practice 100, 150 years ago.
I think that points to the desperation that you feel as a parent when you're so helpless.
Oh, yeah. It was just the other day, a friend of mine on Facebook shared something and tagged me and Tally, actually, talking about an old Appalachian practice of passing your kid through a hole in a tree when they were little. because that was believed to confer protective magic. You'd get two people stand on opposite sides of the hole in the tree, pass the kid back and forth between it, and there you go. I've also heard of plugging a tree as a way to hex somebody or to make a wish or to otherwise actually practice magic. The idea being that you might have one particularly favorite tree, or they might have one tree that's for good stuff happening and one tree that's for bad stuff happening.
Trees, what can't they do?
Right. Have your tree, whichever kind of tree you had, or just your one tree, and you'd write a charm on a piece of paper, or maybe it would be a Bible verse, or maybe it would be what you wanted to have happen on a piece of paper. You'd bore a hole, you'd whittle a plug for that hole, you'd insert the paper into that hole and plug it up, and then the wish would come true, or that effect would remain until that plug rots away.
Cool.
And I've never personally done that, but I knew of people doing that when I was a child.
I was going to say, this isn't that far out there time-wise. I mean, so I'm going to go out on a branch here and come with me on this ride. Are you familiar with the more, you probably are, some of the more mystical elements of Roman Catholicism?
Oh, yeah.
And there is a belief that if you take a statue of a particular saint, bury him upside down in your yard while your house is for sale, that you'll get a better deal on your house. And that's a thing that I know someone in my family that did that.
Really?
Yeah. Someone related this to my grandmother and was like, if you get this statue and you bury it upside down and I can't remember if it was the front yard or the backyard or whatever, bury it down there, put your house on the market, this many Hail Marys or whatever, and boom, you'll be taken care of. So for people that are listening to the show that might, because we have a pretty dispersed geographical audience, right?
Yeah.
And if people are just like, they're down there drilling holes in trees, I would challenge you to talk to some of the Catholics in your life about some of the more mystical traditions and magical traditions.
Yeah.
This isn't super far-fetched. It's interesting, right? I didn't know about that yet, and you didn't know about the real estate saint, but it's a thing. People have beliefs, and it's not as far back in history as one might suspect. Oh, you remember it from being a kid. I remember when my grandmother buried a little statue in the yard when she was selling her house. It's just a thing. It all depends on where you're at geographically.
Yeah. And a lot of this stuff is still done today and people don't talk about it.
Right.
Or things have shifted as culture has shifted and technology has shifted. I think of when I was in high school, we believed that if you drove through a yellow light, you had to kiss your fingertips and then touch the sun visor. I still do that. Just it's such an ingrained habit.
My same grandmother told me that you got to keep a cat away from a baby because the cat will suck out the baby's breath.
Right.
We know now that's from cats looking to sit on something warm.
Yeah.
But it's interesting the lenses that people see things through and the traditions that get carried forward. And to your point, what changes and what doesn't based on society. And anyway, I'm really enjoying this. I had no idea about all the things trees could do. If you'll excuse me, I have to pass some large children through a hole in a tree. Can I just chuck them? Can it just be like
No, it's got to be, they got to be passed back and forth. And I've read that there is also, again, like a charm or a Bible verse or something associated with it, but that's not something that was being done when I was a kid. At least not where I grew up. For all I know, it was happening 5 minutes away. And with that whole plugging the tree thing, if I were going to do that today, I would probably only use a stump or a dead tree, just because I'm not sure that it wouldn't seriously harm a living tree to do that.
I think it depends on the size of the boar, to be honest. But that's good advice. That's good. Okay. Yeah. Good advice, Michael. Fine.
Let's go to doctors and not kill trees. That's where I'm at.
Meanwhile, I'm over here. Throw the child through the tree.
With the passing a kid through the tree thing, I think it had to be a natural gap or one that people had not created.
Yeah, I would imagine. I mean, we don't have trees big enough.
Another common one is stealing milk. This is a common belief.
Okay.
And the idea was that if there were witches in the community, then one of the worst things they did was steal milk from people's cows. They would take a rag, they would say an incantation over it. In some versions of this belief, it was a Bible verse, and some it was a pledge to the devil. In some, it was simply a command to bring milk. And then the witch could hang up the rag and milk the corners like they were udders, and milk would come out. And somewhere nearby, somebody else's cow would go dry.
Hey, Spooky Rag, what do you think? Going to squeeze on your chips? Give me something to drink. Just made that up. Really happy about that.
That is very strange. Wow.
That's the incantation.
I want to.
You'll have to listen to the recording because I don't actually remember what I just said.
Okay. I want to towel with that printed on it. Anyway, the witch might do that because somebody had refused to sell them milk. Was one of the common beliefs. Or they might do this just to get revenge. And the only way to lift the curse in a lot of beliefs, the only way to lift it was to get them to give you something or to refuse to lend them something. And this is something that comes straight out of witchcraft beliefs in Germany and also in the UK and Ireland. One of the examples of the influences of those cultures. Another really common one, I never knew anybody who claimed anybody had stolen milk, by the way, but I knew stories of people having been accused of that in the past in the place where I grew up. So another really common one is removing warts. Wart removal in these practices would come down to one of three methods. Somebody could buy the wart from you. I'm not kidding.
I'd buy that for $1. Really was okay.
Somebody could talk the wart off, or you could somewhat maliciously transfer the wart.
Ooh.
So with buying, you have to know somebody in the community who is a wart buyer. That is a specific kind of folk magician in Appalachian practice. And it shows up in other regions as well. But, this is something that I know specifically associated with Appalachia. That person has some gift and they are renowned as a wart buyer. They take some denomination of money. It's usually a dime or a quarter for each wart that you want removed. So what you do is if you want a wart removed, you go to the wart buyer, you find out what denomination they use, and then you give them however many of that denomination you have warts you want to have removed. And then that person will say to you, I want to buy your wart. And in some versions, they simply give you the money and you go on home, but they do it like one coin at a time. But in most versions, they have to touch one wart with each coin or circle it with a coin and then give that coin back to the person who has come to them for their services. And as they do so, they buy that wart from them. And then over the next few days, the warts will disappear.
I don't like this one. This one's gross.
Not a lot of dermatologists around either.
Sure. Dermatology and wart purchasing. What's the going rate for a wart this week?
That's the deal. Each wart buyer had their standard.
Sure. I'll give you a 2-for-1.
But an important part of it is they didn't keep the money.
Oh.
You brought them the money they were going to use to buy them back from you. So money didn't actually change hands in this. There was a symbolic exchange of money.
That changes my attitude of being the cheapest one in town.
Yeah, there's no advantage there.
Come on down to the Crazy Charlie's wart lot. We got.
I feel like the American Medical Association would have questions for you. It's like Spatula City, but for warts. So talking it off is similar to buying, in that the person who talks the wart off will touch each one, or they'll rub or massage each one while they say some charm, or they'll quote a Bible verse, or otherwise repeat a statement. And often that was described as something they said under their breath so that the patient could not understand what was being said. And in a lot of these practices, if it involved a charm or a phrase, then that person would repeat that phrase or make that statement in a way that obscured it from other people, because that's
weird.
Part of the secret of being trained by the person who taught you.
This is weird. Let's keep it short. Make it secret. Give me that wart.
I don't know. Maybe you just made up a good one. In some versions, the warts are transferred via various means, like you take a string or a piece of twine and you tie one knot in it for each wart. And then you'd take that string to another location and you'd bury it, or you'd abandon it. And the warts would leave the person to go find their knot, was the belief. So you go take it away somewhere and your warts would leave. You might also rub a rag or a bandana on the wart and then tie it around a limb or tie it around the hand where that wart grows, and then wear it for a little while, then take it off and bury it or abandon it. And then the warts would leave to go be with that. My father, when he was 12, had numerous warts removed from his hand by going to a healer who had him tie a bandana around it for a period of time, say some specific words, which he did not tell me, and then bury the bandana in a graveyard on a full moon, and the warts vanished within days.
So weird.
And in some versions, the warts are transferred to the next person to find that twine or walk past it or touch the rag or anything like that. And that's the vaguely malicious version. That's the, we know somebody else is going to get this, but we want them gone.
Sure. Whatever's fastest.
Also, there's dowsing.
I do know about dowsing.
Dowsing is considered by some to be a trained skill. By others, it's an inherited gift. And usually you work with a wooden stick or a pair of metal rods. Mm-hmm. And you think of a wooden stick that's in the shape of a Y, and you hold it by the two ends at the top of the Y. And then you walk the property where you try and find water to dig a well. And if the end of the stick points down, then that's a place where there's water. And if you use two metal rods, they're shaped like L's, and you hold them. And sometimes they're designed so that you can't actually influence which way that the long ends point. Mm-hmm. Then you walk the property, and when they cross each other, that's a place where there's water.
So my father, whose mother is the statue in the Crown Lady.
Yeah.
My grandmother. In that same house that he lived in as a kid, where the statue was buried down the street and around the corner, was a kid whose father did dowsing professionally. He was a well driller. Like, that was his job. And that was his method.
Yeah, and if you live in a place where you have to dig wells, if you have to have a well drilled for a house and on a place that's not on water utility, then one of the good things to ask them is, do they have a dowser that they use?
Yeah.
One of my great uncles was a dowser, and he doused the location of the well at the house where I grew up.
So funny.
Yeah. Sometimes they look for other stuff like buried treasure. There is actually an American Society of Dowsers that was founded in 1961. And there is an Appalachian Dowsers chapter founded in 1981, and it covers Western North Carolina and upstate South Carolina. So if you are into dowsing, they do online training classes and all kinds of stuff.
Water witches, they're sometimes called.
Yes. And then my last thing is forecasting the weather. And there were some specific means of doing that in the place where I grew up. One of them was, if it's winter and you see a ring around the moon in the sky, then count the number of stars you can see inside that ring, and that is how many days until it will snow.
Interesting.
Another one was, if there is snow on the ground for 7 days after it snows, if there is still snow on the ground after 7 days, then it will snow again before it has all melted.
Then it's real cold.
Yeah. A really common belief is, if there are a lot of acorns, then that means it's going to be a hard winter. And also, people in the place where I grew up, and I'm sure this is practiced elsewhere, would learn to smell snow. This was something that people in my family did a lot. And if you went outside, especially in the evening, and there was a particular tang in the air when you smelled it, then that was coming snow.
I'm going to say something, and you can cut this from the episode if you want. I actually relate to that one. If you go out and it's before a snow, there's a certain feeling.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I would say. I'm not saying that I have some mystical gift or can predict the weather, but I do think that you can tell when the odds of snow are high.
Oh, yeah. It was never presented to me as some sort of mystical act. Yeah. It was just, this is how you recognize that there's snow coming.
Yeah.
And it's purely just using human senses to detect the atmosphere. No problem there. I don't think there's anything supernatural about it.
Cool. I'm not trying to sound like I got the secret sauce, but I'm just saying that, like, that one is extremely relatable. Of all the things we have talked about today, that is the one that I'm like, yeah, I can do that.
Oh, yeah. No, like when I was a kid, I got taken outside and told, smell the air now.
Yeah.
There's snow coming. Do you smell that? And I was taught how to do it. And it was not treated as an unnatural skill. It was just like, you just learn to recognize it. I don't think there's anything objectionable about that. And that's everything I've got. That's all the Appalachian folk magic practices I had to talk about.
That's great. I liked that a lot. I appreciate you letting me cut in relating, like, oh, no, this is like that, or I know about that. So that was awesome.
Yeah, totally. Happy to do it. It's stuff that I find really interesting. And there are things in there that people have mentioned in comments or in emails over the years and said, hey, it'd be great if you talked about this sometime. So I'm trying to do a big grab bag of a bunch of that. But also this stuff really genuinely fascinates me.
And I'm sure we'll get more after this episode.
I'm sure. It's also funny to me because I realized in the middle of recording this that whenever I talk about these things, I sound more like my native accent. And I don't do as much professional radio voice or whatever because this stuff I don't know. It transports me back there.
It's awesome. I liked it a lot. Thank you for that. I look forward to drawing the art for it for volume 2 when it's included in the book that you're writing.
Indeed. I will include a pretty big chapter on a bunch of this stuff and talk about times that I saw it done and all kinds of stuff.
That comment is specifically for the people that say what's up with volume 2 of the book. Volume 1 came out in September. Michael's going to write volume 2. I'll still do some doodles for it. That's how we're going to do it. Since we have our own episodes, we don't want to step on each other's stuff. We're going to alternate.
Yeah.
That's sort of what's up with it for the folks that were asking. And to all the people that bought volume 1, thank you very much. It's been really fun hearing from people about how they've enjoyed sharing it with the folks in their lives. So thanks for that.
Yeah, that's been really great.
We'll get back to recording some more episodes here. And thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. For more episodes, behind the scenes information, and links to our social media, check out www.arcanecarolinas.com, where you can also buy the Arcane Carolinas book.
And if you like award-winning horror and science fiction, check out my books at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com or visit my publisher, Falstaff Books, at falstaffbooks.com. And if you have story suggestions, comments, or questions, email us at arcanecarolinas@gmail.com. And thanks for listening. Episodes to be released.
Hold on. I'm going to interrupt you in typical fashion.
Okay.